Judaism is at a very interesting turning point in the history of religion. And this is something that Smith brings out somewhat in contrasting the polytheism, especially the polytheism of Egypt and Greece, to that of the monotheism of the Hebrew peoples. And he brings out a number of elements of this, some of which are better than others in terms of his presentation, in trying to identify why it is that the Hebrew people were led to this kind of development, insight, revelation, however it is that you want to characterize it. But at the very least, how it is that we see this novelty at this time with these people is certainly something very interesting and very controversial, and of course very important for the history of Western civilization, because this is the beginning of the tide that would become all of the Abrahamic religions, Christianity, Islam, Judaism. And so we're talking about somewhere around half the world's population now being influenced by what began with ostensibly the Hebrew people. And I say ostensibly because we're going to talk about some other aspects of and some other theories with respect to this. Now, it's awfully hard to know much of anything with respect to the origins of these things. We're talking about really before the books were written, and then also a period of which we don't have a great deal of history with respect to the Hebrew people in terms of, hey, this, as Smith said, this is not a large empire. This is a nomadic people that we're talking about, and a small player politically. And so this is someone that doesn't leave us a great deal of evidence and history with respect to precise dating and chronology into the second millennium BC. And so while we see monotheism of a form arising in Egypt around the 14th century BC, we don't see writings, as far as we can tell, from the Hebrew Bible until several centuries after this. And so while there's a lot of misinformation about these writings tracing back to that time, to the 14th and 15th centuries BC, in fact, current scholarship leans to a much later date for all of the different books. And if we're talking about the extension between the Hebrew Bible, the Christian Old Testament, into the New Testament in Christianity, we have really an unbroken series of prophetic writings beginning around 700, 800 BC, extending all the way into the time of Christ and beyond, with the latest books of the Hebrew Bible being written right before the time of Christ. And so it's not as though we have this very ancient tradition and then 1,000 years later all of a sudden we have Christianity. This is a continuous tradition of which Christianity is a part. And so that, I think, is important to realize, and that can be important for us to realize because this puts the writing of most of the books of what people are familiar with in our society, by and large, as the Bible, most of the books of the Old Testament much later than they are commonly talked about. And so I think it's important for us to realize and to look with a critical eye at what's going on in the culture at that time. So we're seeing the downfall of Egypt, the rise of the Ptolemies, and then Alexander the Great and the Greeks, and then Roman civilization as well. And all throughout there is this, and I think Smith is quite right to point this out, and as a number of anthropologists have done so, that it's really amazing that Judaism survived in the way that it did. And that there was so much really constellation of preservation of tradition in the way that it was done throughout so much political volatility. This is really an extraordinary thing, especially for the ancient world, because The Hebrew people were, as I said, kind of, and this is something that Smith has some colorful terms for. They were not a major political player. They were not one of the major empires, and so they struggled for independence. They struggled for keeping their own land, keeping their own traditions intact, and not being entirely overwhelmed and subjugated by the larger political forces. So that in itself is very interesting, but it doesn't directly address the question of what's going on. Why is it that we see so much that's new with Judaism? Because really, that's what's of principal interest for us about Judaism in this class. There's so much that's new. There's so much that is introduced apparently with Judaism, not just with monotheism, but in terms of a more inward turning religion, something that is, as he says, morality focused, as if meaning was given by way of morality. Now, let's take a closer look at this, because I think it's easy to oversell the point, and I'm worried a bit that Smith does oversell the point in saying that, for instance, all the rules that we find in Leviticus, and then the very rule-oriented orthopraxical, as he says, with that Judaism is more of an orthopraxis than an orthodoxy. In other words, it's more of a practice, it's more of a system of traditions and rites and rituals and whatnot than it is an orthodoxy in terms of dogma and belief and doctrine. And this is of course very important because this points to it being older. It points to similarities with traditions that are older, because a lot of the polytheistic traditions and a lot of the older, more traditional societies are more focused on ritual. They are more focused on the solidarity of the group through ritual, and the individual beliefs and thoughts of the people, the individual lives even as individuals, are not that important compared to the solidarity of the group, the traditions, the exercising of the traditions, the participation in the traditions. And this emphasis in Judaism recalls more of what we see with the polytheistic and otherwise traditional forms of religion than what we get with Christianity and Islam and Buddhism and Hinduism, later Hinduism especially, Upanishadic Hinduism and so on. And so really Judaism is an interesting case study in this way because it retains a lot of vestiges of the older forms of religiosity in terms of the emphasis on rites and rituals, on orthopraxy, on the correct practice of the rites and rituals, the involvement in the traditions and the cultural practices for their own sake, and less on the individual psychology. Now, this is not going to be quite the story that you get in Smith. He, I think, makes it sound a little too different than what we see with the polytheistic religions that surrounded the Hebrews. I'm not convinced that it's so different in the way that he describes, at least with respect to this sort of thing. Now, it is different with respect to the inward turning, the more psychological focus, the more individual focus, and certainly with respect to, especially, and this is crucial, linear history. So the Jewish history, the emphasis on history, that is really very different than what we get with the more archetypally focused cyclical histories of polytheistic Egypt and Greece. And so what we're really watching with the development of Judaism is the transformation from the archetypal forms, the cyclical form of religious history, the archetypal form of religion, to the individual form of religion and the linear form of history, where the history becomes something that's very important. It is a once repeated thing. It is a one-time shot. And so what's interesting about this is that with the stories that we get in Judaism, you have the creation story in Genesis, the creation stories in Genesis, and the choosing of a particular people, the stories of the anointed ones, the Messiah, and however it is that one wants to interpret this, and then eventually, as we move on into Christianity, the destruction and the apocalypse. And and by the way, of course, the Great Flood and all of these other things. A lot of these stories are the same kinds of stories that we hear in Greece and especially in Egypt. A lot of the stories that we get, for instance, just to give you a particularly provocative example, a baby being given up for, so that it won't be destroyed, floated down a river in a flat thatched reed basket, picked up, taken care of, hidden, and going on to greatness. This is the story of Osiris. In many of the details, of course, also the story of Moses, and so many others like this. So the stories that we get, and I don't think Smith did enough to emphasize this. The stories that we get in Judaism are really very similar to the other stories that we see in the surrounding cultural complex of Egypt and Greece and Rome and the Middle East at this time. So it's not novel in that way. The themes being expressed in the flood, in the creation, in all of the different aspects of those stories in terms of the tree of knowledge, and then the creation of man and woman and those sorts of things. The broad brush topics that we see here are very much the same in a lot of the other myths, but he is right at least to emphasize the fact that they're different in important respects. And if you recall, Campbell said something about this with respect to the way that that man and woman were created in Genesis in comparison to other mythological systems, such that we have a more individual-focused myth. And in other ways, this is true as well, and this is where Smith does well with it, I think, in pointing out that the chosen people idea, clearly we have other instances of this in religious history. In fact, it's a commonplace, really, to regard one's own people as privileged in some way and everybody else as barbarians. The barbarian is a Greek word that basically refers to everybody who's not us. And so there's really nothing unusual about that, but the idea that there is a chosen people, and that chosen people is this, particular group of individuals that has a historical significance and a historical role to play in the redemption of the world. This is starting to become something a bit different. And so it's the slight individual twists that we see to the stories. In other words, there are bits and pieces that come to emphasize more the role of the individual and the role of the individual in salvation, in the redemption of the world, the correction of the political order and of nature. And as Smith says in a rather pithy remark, a polytheist would not suggest that nature needed correcting. It needed instead supporting status quo, keep things as they are. He has something amusing to say with this in that instead of saying that nature needs correcting and being impressed at how well things could be, instead, how good things could be, instead he is impressed by how bad things could be if they got worse, So instead of hoping for better, he's simply trying to prevent things from being worse. I don't know if there's really any substance to that particular claim, but it is at least true that the polytheistic systems insisted upon total worldviews, and they were not intent on improving nature in a historical framework. There was no sense that each generation is going to be better than the last. Generations have value insofar as they participate in the archetypes. In other words, insofar as they are not historically bound. And so it's anathema to polytheism and to traditional religion generally to do what it is that is done with linear history in Hebrew religiosity. In other words, to give it significance and to provide religious significance by way of historical significance. This represents a genuine break and something that is very different from what we see before. Now, if we look to the more modern forms, especially more modern interpretations of Christianity, then we're going to see a very historically oriented religion in a way that seems very foreign to what we get with ancient Greek polytheism, let's say, and so the two just seem really very different from one another. This is where studying Judaism is very interesting, because Judaism is closer to what we see with ancient Greek religion. As I said before, with the rites and rituals, emphasis on participation more than individual dogma and belief. In fact, as Smith rightly points out, the Greeks increasingly became philosophically inclined and concerned with doxa, opinion. And so what was going on psychologically for the individual became more and more important, and they came to lead lives that were increasingly concerned with the abstract. And one that is concerned with the abstract is not going to be concerned with the prosaic physical existence of the individual. In other words, the individual who lives in history and in time. And so we see something very different with Judaism, at least in this way. Messianism provides a particularly obvious example of the concern with linear history and the concern with progress. The idea that a Messiah is going to come and is going to somehow fix things, make things better, is an idea that is wrapped up very much with progress. It's wrapped up with historical change. And this kind of approach to religion is very foreign to what we see with traditional and polytheistic religions. And so that aspect of Judaism, once we see Messianism, this concern with the coming of the Messiah, or the talk of messiahs. This is a strong signal that we're seeing a different form of religion developing, and something different is certainly coming. Now, let's juxtapose, because one of the reasons that I focused on the dates with Judaism and the writing of the various books of the Hebrew Bible is because they are at the same time, in many cases, as what we see with the Greek world in Greek philosophy. Greek philosophy also arose around the 7th century, continued on in an unbroken chain unto Roman times and beyond. And the emphasis there is decidedly different. The emphasis in Greek philosophy is much more in the head, is much more in the abstract. And the emphasis in Judaism is much more on the here and now, the individual's role in history. So while Plato pushed for an escape of the body, escape from the body, an escape entirely into the world of the mind, the world of the forms, this is not at all what we get in Judaism. And so even though these two are developing, they're new, it's very different than what we see from previous forms of religion, and they are developing alongside one another. These are not far separate. Many of the Greek philosophers went to Egypt to study, and the Hebrew people were not far separated, obviously. from the Egyptians in their history, to put it mildly. And so we are not looking at a completely different cultural complex, but at the same time, we are looking at two different strains that diverge at this time. One with Greek philosophy, and then one with Judaism. And so these are going to kind of go back and forth and meet again in Christianity. Christianity in this way represents, in some way, a synthesis of what we get with Greek and Roman culture and philosophy and Judaism. And but nevertheless, it's important, I think, to recognize the significant differences that we see, the novelties that we see with Judaism, whether monotheism originated with Judaism or not. You may have heard with Freud. Freud advanced a theory that has been largely discredited, but is nonetheless interesting. It's interesting that he put this much effort into it. In a book called Moses and Monotheism, that Moses was not in fact Hebrew, that he was actually born into Egyptian aristocracy, was a follower of Akhenaten, and who was the pharaoh who pushed for monotheism, atenism, the focus on the solar deity Aten, and that the source of Hebrew ideas then was not in fact from the Hebrew people, but was in fact Egyptian in origin. That's his thesis. Like I said, there's been a lot of quarreling over this sort of thing, and it was certainly provocative, especially for when it was published as early as it was. So that's an interesting tidbit to know. One other brief note on Judaism. What we see in terms of a progression historically is in pre-Egyptian, so one is inclined to say pre-Sumerian, pre-literate societies. We see an emphasis on nature and the gods of nature, and religion was very much focused on what was more or less at eye level and below. And so the gods inhabited and the divine was seen and experienced here and now among things that we are accustomed to dealing with, the trees and plants and people and rocks and these sorts of things. And as people moved into better mathematics, more developed forms, especially of astronomy, and noticing that the stars moved regularly, that it was not random, and that there were discernible patterns. The focus moved and shifted upward, and so we see, instead of just being concerned with nature, we see the concern moving to the heavens and to the stars, and so the movements of the stars and the gods then moving upwards as well. And so this, we start seeing this around, let's say, 2000 BC or so. And then after this, with monotheisms, of which Judaism is certainly a part, we see a move even further to what is transcendent. So you have the earthly, the heavenly, and then onto what is entirely transcendent. And in doing this, this is what I want to suggest to you. There's a very interesting movement that happens. When things are earthly and they are here with us below and they're things that we can touch and interact with, it's easier for us perhaps to think that we have some power over them. And that these are things, even with the magnificent natural forces as they are of earthquakes and floods and thunderstorms and these sorts of things, they're nevertheless here and now. You can touch them, And so it's not as hard to imagine magical rights in terms of being able to influence things and human beings having real power in this way. And so people were thought of as on par with the gods in some cases. And so the more powerful sorcerers could even compel them in certain ways and this sort of thing. As the gods move into the heavens, they become more removed. and they become more powerful. They become more other. In other words, they are no longer on par with people. They become distinctly other, and they become something a bit more frightening and a bit more, other, different than humanity. And so human concerns and dealing with the gods then changes necessarily, because the nature of the gods also change. And so what we see, and this is perhaps the most interesting transition, and I think this is one of the, take it for what it's worth, more provocative ways of describing the transition into the axial age. In other words, the axial age being the transition period from cyclical history to linear history. In other words, the birth of Judaism, and then the birth of philosophy, and then later Christianity. This is the inward turn. In other words, instead of being concerned with what is out there in nature, what is out there in the stars, as the divine transcends even the stars and goes beyond the stars, there's nowhere else to go. And so the divine becomes mental in a certain way. And what I mean by this is what we see, especially with later forms of mysticism. There is a concern then with the, for instance, think of the Platonic forms. The Platonic forms are something that is entirely, they're entirely incorporeal. And the thought that we have of them, the understanding that we have of the archetypes, the way that our minds can think in terms of all of these things. As Aristotle would say, the mind is capable of taking on any form. And so the mind must not have a form itself, which makes the mind divine. It makes it like God. And this was something that was picked up on and used over and over again in Christianity, directly from Aristotle, who, of course, was taking a great deal of influence from Plato, his teacher. But the point here is that, and this is what I really want to underscore, so the gods were very much with us in nature, moving upwards towards the sky and then beyond into the transcendent. As this happens, there's nowhere else for the gods to go physically. And so it's natural for us to become a bit more introspective in terms of, well, how do we understand a divine that is one? So how do we understand a henotheism? In other words, a theism that is based upon unity, a monotheism. How do we understand a monotheism? What would that even mean? Well, one thing that it would mean is that we must understand, we must re-understand, reimagine creation, and reimagine what it means to be divine. And so in doing this, we end up effecting an inward turn, and we end up with something very much like what we see with Augustine, where he is going to suggest that God is not directly available to us in any given thing, just like the Platonic forms. Not a coincidence. Augustine was a Platonist, as were most of the other church fathers. God is not available to us in any of the forms that we see, in any of the physical things that we see. And so the best that we can do to try and get to know God is to look to that which is an image of God. And that which is an image of God is the human person, and not just the human body, but the human mind in particular. And not just the human mind in terms of its desires, because we share this with the animals, but what it is that makes us distinctly human. And Aristotle identified this basically for all time in terms of theological implications, because this is something that people draw from over and over. Our rationality. Aristotle is going to say our rationality is what makes us distinctly human. And so our rationality must therefore be that which makes us an image of God. Kind of connecting the dots, as a number of theologians and mystics would do later. And so if that is the case, then what is most divine is mind. What is most divine is reason understood in this way. And we hear hints of this in the Greek world order, because if you recall, the very beginning for the Greeks, their cosmogonic story, their cosmogony, begins with chaos, and out of the chaos comes order. Out of the waters of chaos come order, just like the Genesis story. And so, so an inward turn, and we see an increasing emphasis on the individual and an enriching thereby of the individual's psychological life. And so what is hardest for us, as I've said all semester, what is hardest for us to understand about polytheistic systems and about traditional forms of religion is that there is not so much a concern with individual welfare, individual thoughts, the individual psychological life, as if everything that we thought and experienced belonged just to me, just to the I, the ego. It's very difficult for us to imagine what this would be like not to think like that. And this point in history where God becomes something transcendent and we start seeing the earliest forms of monotheism, this is where we really see the transition into a conception of the divine that becomes mental, that becomes rational, that becomes abstract, ultimately abstract and not physical. And this allows for a separation of the divine from the physical world in important ways. And this is why you end up, as I'd mentioned with Plato, wanting to escape from the body. The prison of the body is the metaphor there, into the mind. And so it's worth repeating that this is where the novelty in Judaism, the novelty in this period, is localized in not just, hey, monotheism now instead of all these different gods. It's easy to tell too simple a story with respect to that. But I think it's really important for us to look at what monotheism actually could mean, especially to someone who is accustomed to living in a polytheistic world. So if you're conversant with what that world might be like, then trying to imagine, how do we understand a single God? What does it mean for God to be one? For God to be entirely transcendent? What does that mean? How are we to understand that kind of thing? And in the process of doing that, does it necessitate an inward turn? Now, I don't want to depict it as though, well, we had monotheism first, then people had to figure it out and figure out what it means, and then, oh, there was this inward turn. That's not what I'm trying to say. That's more or less just a kind of, rhetorical move in terms of the story has to be told in some way. It's fairly likely that these are coeval. In other words, that they grew up together. But nonetheless, it's worth trying to understand, how does this development happen?